Inside room 2141 of the U.S. Capitol, firebrand Marjorie Taylor Greene slams a top-secret classified dossier onto the desk, swearing 6 brutal assaults prove transgender students are turning schools into war zones. Unflinching Jasmine Crockett waits a single heartbeat, then detonates the moment, holding up the unedited file in a bombshell email chain that exposes the stats as lobbyist-forged fiction. Lenses zoom as Greene's gavel rattles like a gun misfiring, her color drains, and in 15 breath-snatching seconds her crusade implodes on live TV. Credibility disintegrated, career hanging by a thread. If one counterfeit document can obliterate a congressional powerhouse this fast, what explosive secrets are still ticking beneath the marble floors of Washington? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 2141 didn't feel like a hearing room. It felt like a trap. The polished mahogany table gleamed under cold light, sterile as a surgical bay. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat at the head, posture rigid, gavel ready like a loaded weapon. Her aides whispered and adjusted cameras, not for truth, but performance. On paper, it was a hearing on school safety and gender in federal education policy. In practice, it was a stage set for political bloodsport. Down the table, Jasmine Crockett sat alone, silent, still, unreadable. No theatrics, no entourage, just a folder, a pen, and eyes that didn't blink. Rumors swirled that she carried a sealed document, something powerful enough to detonate beneath Greene's narrative, but she made no move to reveal it. Not yet. The press sensed it. Cameras blinked red. Reporters scribbled without knowing why, only that something was about to break. 2 hours before the hearing, Politico dropped an exclusive. Leaked emails from Greene's office revealing she had personally pushed to defund LGBTQ+ student support services from the Department of Education's mental health budget. The emails were dated, stamped, confirmed. But no one on the Hill had addressed it, not yet. Staffers were whispering. Committee members were checking their phones under the table. And Greene? She hadn't even flinched. Not because she wasn't aware, but because she was betting on one thing: silence. But Jasmine Crockett had built her life on breaking silence. She wasn't here to watch the fire. She was here to strike the match. The silence didn't last long, because Marjorie Taylor Greene had no intention of letting it. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to lead. It was to ignite. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. What she lacked in volume, she made up for in venom. We are here today because safety in American schools is no longer guaranteed. She began, each word clipped, measured, devoid of warmth. Not when biological males are allowed to enter girls' locker rooms, dominate girls' sports, and silence real female students who are too afraid to speak up. Her cadence was deliberate, punctuated by soft taps of her fingers against the desk, like a countdown. She spoke as if she were reading from a script written in fear, not fact. Every phrase designed to paint inclusion as intrusion, every sentence calculated to trigger discomfort, not dialogue. 6 incidents in 3 months, she continued, lifting a sheet of paper filled with highlighted headlines. Assaults, injuries, trauma, and all under the false banner of inclusivity. There was no context, no verification, just numbers, stripped from source, weaponized through repetition. No one interrupted her, but no one leaned in either. Even those on her side of the aisle watched carefully now, wary of how far she might go. Her tone was steady, but there was something brittle in it too, something desperate to reclaim a narrative that had already begun to slip. She knew this was her moment to set the stage, and she would burn the floor if it meant keeping the spotlight. Then came the shift. Greene lowered the paper, her eyes scanning the room, not to connect, but to target. Her gaze swept left, then locked like a laser on Jasmine Crockett. The pause was calculated. Then came the line, sharp and unmistakable. And let's be honest, it's not just the policies, it's the people pushing them. She leaned forward, letting the silence stretch a second too long before delivering the blow. We can't let certain voices in this room, who constantly scream equality, turn this nation into a playground for chaos. The air in the room constricted, not with gasps or shouts, but with that quiet recoil that comes when everyone senses a line has just been crossed. It wasn't a critique. It was a provocation. It wasn't about safety. It was about silencing. And everyone in the room knew exactly who she meant. Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. But her hand moved. Calmly. Deliberately. Reaching for her pen like a swordsman reaching for steel. She didn't blink. Didn't shift. But her stillness said more than words ever could. "You've fired your shot. Now watch what comes next." But Greene wasn't finished, because when intimidation didn't land, she reached for something far more dangerous. Fabrication dressed as fact. With a calculated pause, Greene reached beneath her stack of prepared notes and lifted a thin manila folder marked in bold red, "Confidential." She didn't announce it immediately. She let the sight of that word do the talking. The room reacted like a wound being pressed. Eyebrows lifted. Phones clicked on. Her staff, carefully planted along the wall, exchanged subtle glances. She tapped the folder once against the table, letting the sound echo through the silence like a warning shot. Then she raised it with both hands and declared, "This is a Department of Education briefing. Restricted circulation, confirming growing concerns about trans students in federally funded schools." The sentence dropped like a weight into the room. There was no verification, no accompanying cover page, just a flash of red ink, bold headers, and heavy black redactions, meant to create the illusion of depth where none existed. She opened the folder theatrically, revealing a page lined with cherry-picked phrases underlined in highlighter: increased disruption, parental outrage, loss of trust. She held it up like gospel, yet never offered to share the source. "I was told not to share this," she added, her tone slipping into mock defiance. "But the American people deserve to know." What she didn't say, what she hoped no one would say, was that the page bore no official stamp, no agency letterhead, and no sign of chain of custody authentication. It wasn't a leak. It was a plant. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her face didn't shift. But beneath her stillness, a storm was quietly coiling. Her eyes moved, scanning the page Greene held aloft, not with panic, but with precision. One blink, two, then nothing. She simply waited, one hand resting on her folder, the other near her pen, but unmoved. The silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. Across the room, reporters began whispering. One journalist from Reuters leaned toward a colleague at NPR, mouthing, "That doesn't look real." A producer for C-SPAN checked the government database on her tablet and frowned. Even a few Republican aides were beginning to shift uneasily in their seats, wondering what, exactly, Greene had just placed into the record. But Greene was too deep into her monologue to notice, or too committed to care. She drew herself taller, her voice growing sharper as she turned toward Jasmine. "This document shows exactly what happens when ideology replaces policy, when feelings override facts, when people like Ms. Crockett," she paused, pointing now, deliberate and direct, "inject identity politics into spaces meant for learning." The accusation wasn't veiled. It was a public strike designed to humiliate. Greene had just fired a shot meant to wound in public, but what followed wasn't retaliation. It was silence. And somehow that made it more terrifying. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at Greene. Instead, she slowly returned her attention to the folder in front of her, flipping a page with the kind of quiet precision that only sharpened the tension in the room. She picked up her pen, not hurriedly, but like a surgeon selecting a scalpel. She began to write, methodically, with no visible reaction, as if Greene's entire tirade hadn't just been hurled at her. Every few seconds, she looked up, not at Greene, not at the cameras, just a slow, searching glance across the committee dais, as if reading the measure of a room that hadn't realized it was already failing its own integrity. Her silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was control, and that terrified people more than any rebuttal ever could. Behind Greene, a few of her supporters began to whisper. One leaned in close and muttered, "Why isn't she saying anything?" Another replied, low and nervous, "She's waiting for something." Even the air seemed to thicken. Staffers glanced at each other. Reporters shifted in their seats. The press pit, once full of quiet clicks and scrolling fingers, had gone still. All eyes drifted from Greene's performance to Crockett's restraint. The lens operators adjusted, gently, instinctively, zooming in on Jasmine, not for drama, but for anticipation. Because in a room where outrage had just been weaponized, her calm looked like the fuse before an explosion. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of an old clock on the back wall echoed through the chamber like a countdown. Not to chaos, but to clarity. It was one of those antique congressional relics, its ticking usually drowned out by crosstalk and commotion, but now it sounded like a war drum. Time wasn't on Greene's side anymore. It belonged to the silence, to the stillness, to Jasmine Crockett, who hadn't spoken a word, but had already shifted the entire room just by refusing to play the game. The room was holding its breath, but it was Jasmine who broke the silence, not with words, but with a simple, deliberate motion that changed everything. Jasmine raised her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew she didn't need permission, only timing. Her fingers barely moved above her folder, but the motion cut through the air like a scalpel. All eyes turned. Greene froze for a split second, her smirk flickering. Then came the response, tight-lipped, half-laughed, laced with contempt. "We're operating under a tight schedule today." The dismissal wasn't procedural, it was personal. But even before Jasmine could respond, a soft voice from behind the dais intervened. A congressional attorney, seated just off-camera, leaned forward and quietly reminded the chair, "Ms. Crockett is entitled to time under Rule 11, Section 2. Greene's jaw twitched. She didn't look at the lawyer. She didn't look at Jasmine. She looked straight ahead, blinked twice, and muttered, "Fine." The word hung heavy in the air, conceded, not granted. And the second it left Greene's mouth, the entire chamber shifted. Camera operators moved in near unison, pivoting toward Jasmine like predators tracking the only movement that mattered. Reporters sat up straighter, pens poised. Even the ambient hum of the room changed, from chaos held at bay to anticipation pressed to the edge. Jasmine didn't thank her. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just straightened her papers, folded her hands, and waited for the microphone to glow green. The moment wasn't loud, but it belonged to her now, and everyone knew it. As Jasmine silently claimed the floor, the camera light still warming her skin, something shifted behind Greene. Quietly, but with the weight of an incoming collapse. A young aide moved swiftly behind the chair, half bent, face pale, gripping a folded slip of paper like it was radioactive. He didn't speak aloud, just slipped it into Greene's waiting hand with the speed of someone trying not to be noticed. She unfolded it beneath the desk, eyes scanning the short sentence printed in tight, urgent font. "They've confirmed. One of the stats you cited was fabricated." Her throat tightened. A flash of heat bloomed at the base of her neck. She didn't look up. Not yet. But her fingers tensed, curling ever so slightly around the edges of the paper, as if she could crush the truth into pulp. She had spent the last 20 minutes painting herself as the voice of reason, of fact, of moral defense. And now, with Jasmine Crockett moments from speaking, she was holding a live grenade in the form of a correction. The camera didn't catch the paper, but it caught her reaction, the way her posture lost an inch, the slight stutter in her next breath, the involuntary twitch in her left eyebrow. Her supporters didn't notice it, but the press did. One AP reporter began typing faster. A producer at CBS whispered into her mic, "Check her citations. Something's off." And still Greene sat, composed on the outside, unraveling on the inside. She couldn't withdraw the statement, not without looking weak. But if Jasmine had caught it, and Greene was now certain she had, it was only a matter of time before the truth was weaponized and flung right back at her. The problem wasn't that the number was false. The problem was that the wrong person had just been given a mic, and she wasn't afraid of the fallout. She was made for it. The green light on Jasmine's mic flickered to life with a faint click, barely audible, but in that moment, it sounded like a starter pistol. Her posture didn't change. No grand gestures, no sudden movement, just a breath, steady, deliberate. And then her voice, calm as morning steel. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone gentle but focused, "but I can't seem to let go of one detail." She didn't rush. Every word was intentional, every pause weighted, as if laying down the foundation for something that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. Her gaze drifted, not directly at Greene, but toward the folder still resting by her elbow, the one stamped confidential, now quietly burning under 1,000 watts of national attention. The document you presented, who verified it? The room, which had just moments ago been shifting in hushed reaction to the aide's warning note, fell utterly still. Jasmine's question didn't come with accusation, not yet. It came with the kind of careful inquiry that feels more dangerous than outrage, because it was surgical, and everyone could feel the scalpel coming. Greene blinked, once, twice. Her lips parted slightly as if a reflex answer tried to form before realizing it wasn't ready. Jasmine didn't give her the release of interruption. She let the silence hang, tight, dry, and public. Then Jasmine flipped a page in her folder, slowly, methodically, the soft sound of paper louder than any rebuttal. Because I've reviewed every Department of Education briefing from the last 3 months, she continued, her voice unwavering, and I haven't seen a single internal document with the phrasing you read aloud, let alone one stamped confidential without metadata or origin. That hit harder than volume ever could. She was holding up a mirror, but not for reflection, for exposure. Reporters leaned forward. A few fingers hovered over keyboards, not typing yet, just waiting. One aide from the minority party's side stopped writing entirely and looked up, visibly tense. Still, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She wasn't trying to dominate the room. She was dismantling it, brick by brick. So again, just for clarity's sake, can you tell us exactly who authenticated that file before you entered it into the record? Her tone didn't waver. It didn't need to, because in that moment, what Jasmine delivered wasn't just a question, it was an opening incision. And the room, whether they admitted it or not, knew the bleeding had begun. For a heartbeat, the room stood frozen in Jasmine's question, sharp, surgical, and impossible to dodge. And when Greene finally answered, the crack in her composure wasn't just visible, it was deafening. She hesitated. It was subtle, only a second or two, but in a setting where timing was everything, that pause spoke louder than any rebuttal. Greene adjusted her chair, her movements no longer fluid but stiff, as though her body sensed the truth closing in before her mind could catch up. Her eyes dropped to the folder like it might offer her a way out. It didn't. Her fingers, once confidently tapping out her dominance, now fidgeted against the table, out of rhythm, betraying nerves she couldn't disguise. Then came the response, brittle and unsatisfying. My office collected it from multiple sources? The words hung in the air, incomplete, hollow, an answer meant to deflect rather than explain. There was no agency named, no date given, no classification acknowledged, just a vague shrug disguised as a defense. The weight of that non-answer settled over the chamber like a thick fog. Staffers looked at one another, uneasy. Several Republican aides avoided eye contact altogether, their shoulders visibly stiffening. A reporter from the Washington Post stopped mid-sentence in her notepad, circled the quote twice, and underlined it. The photographer behind her zoomed in on Greene's hands, zoomed in on the tremble. Because this wasn't just a political stumble, it was a structural failure in real time, broadcast across the nation. Greene's vague deflection still echoed in the air when Jasmine, without raising her voice, reached into her folder, not for a rebuttal, but for the truth she had been saving like a final arrow. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she moved with the same quiet precision that had defined her since the hearing began. Her hand slipped inside her folder, pulled out a single document, and held it up. Not for drama, but for clarity. The paper was clean, uncreased, and unmistakable. Do not circulate, internal draft. The watermark ran diagonally across the top in faded gray, the kind used in interagency files not meant for public eyes. Gasps didn't erupt, but they weren't needed. The silence was louder. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Aide after aide sat up straighter, suddenly unsure of what had just been introduced into the bloodstream of the hearing. Even the reporters paused mid-type, recalibrating the gravity of the moment. Jasmine didn't look at Greene. She looked at the paper, and only the paper, like it held a weight no amount of shouting could compete with. Then gently she placed it on the table in front of her, letting it sit there like evidence at the center of a trial. This is the original document, not the one selectively edited and stripped of source data, she said, her voice calm, almost clinical. This draft was leaked internally weeks ago, flagged by multiple agencies as incomplete, unverified, and not intended for public release. Her words cut not with volume, but with precision, the kind that leaves no room to run, no wiggle, no denial, just fact, cold and final. She didn't embellish. She didn't moralize. She simply turned over the blade. So when we talk about facts, about what's real and what's manufactured, we owe it to the American people to be honest about which version we're using to justify policy decisions. Greene didn't respond. She didn't reach for her gavel. She didn't even blink, because in that moment, she knew what the room now knew. She hadn't just been caught misinformed. She'd been caught manipulating, and Jasmine Crockett had delivered the truth not with fury, but with surgical force. The chamber wasn't just quiet, it was stripped bare, and all that remained was a document on the table and a lie unraveling in real time. The document Jasmine had just laid bare had shifted the ground beneath Greene's feet, but what followed next didn't just shake the room, it shattered the illusion. With the room dead silent, Jasmine reached once more into her folder, slower this time, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who knew the storm was no longer approaching. It was already here. She pulled out a second sheet, folded 3 times, stamped with a digital header line unmistakably sourced from a government oversight committee. She unfolded it, held it between her fingers, just long enough for the watermark and metadata to glint under the lights, and then laid it flat. Her tone didn't change. It didn't rise. It simply hardened. "What's more concerning," she said evenly, "is that I have here an email chain confirming exactly where that altered draft came from." She looked up, not at Greene, but into the space between them, where truth now stood like a witness ready to testify. It was sent directly to Congresswoman Greene's office by a known political lobbying group, one currently under federal investigation, for coordinated disinformation campaigns targeting public education policy. The ripple across the chamber was immediate, no longer a shift. It was a fracture. Heads turned, aides whispered, phones lit up. Reporters looked at one another with the urgency of people who had just been handed the real story. Greene froze, one hand still gripping the gavel, the other twitching as though deciding whether to grab the paper, deny its existence, or simply run from it. Jasmine didn't wait. She flipped the email printout to the highlighted page and began to read. Slow, clear, deliberate. Messaging strategy, amplify public fear, exploit uncertainty around gender identity, coordinate with sympathetic media figures to redirect the narrative. She paused. Let the line settle. Then turned another page, her voice cutting through the room like cold air. Use emotionally charged case studies. Do not cite original sources. Prioritize virality over accuracy. Greene's face changed. Her hands, so steady at the start of the hearing, were now trembling against the desk. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Jasmine didn't look at her. Not yet. She addressed the chamber, her voice steady but sharp as broken glass. Is this what defending women looks like? Or is it just defending your political power? The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like a closing argument in a courtroom that had already decided the verdict. Greene stood abruptly. I need a 5-minute recess, she snapped, her voice brittle, eyes darting for an escape. But before she could take a step, a committee clerk leaned in quietly and replied, Request denied. You yielded the time. It was procedural, but it sounded like judgment. Something inside Greene snapped. Her hand slammed the gavel once, then again, harder. This hearing is out of order, she screamed. The third strike echoed too loud, a thud of desperation. Security, she barked, voice cracking under the weight of unraveling authority. But there was no security rushing in. There was no order to restore. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't shout. She simply kept speaking, calm, precise, unstoppable. Because when truth finally steps into the light, Even the loudest hammer can't drown it out. The gavel strikes had failed to silence Jasmine. The truth had already breached the walls. And Greene, cornered, exposed, unraveling, did the only thing she had left. She screamed. "I am the chair of this hearing," Greene shouted, her voice no longer controlled, no longer polished. It came out raw, panicked like a fire alarm no one believed anymore. "I have the authority to demand that you stop," she screamed again, this time pointing directly at Jasmine, her finger trembling in the air. But the room didn't react with fear. It reacted with stillness. Jasmine remained seated, composed, her hands folded atop the very documents that had just detonated the illusion of Greene's control. The microphones caught everything, every ragged breath, every syllable distorted by fury. Greene's voice, once the centerpiece of the chamber, was now out of tune, frantic, and cracking beneath the weight of the truth she could no longer contain. Her gavel hung limp in her hand, lifted but powerless. Even her own party sat motionless. No one moved to support her. No one echoed her cry. Because in that moment, it was clear. Greene wasn't leading. She was breaking. The woman who had walked in prepared to dominate the stage was now clawing to reclaim it, and failing. Jasmine didn't respond. Not with words, not with a glance. Her silence was louder than Greene's screaming. And that, more than anything else, was what shook the chamber to its core. Greene's voice was still reverberating, jagged, unmoored, but its power had already dissolved. What remained was noise, fading fast in a room now transfixed by the woman who hadn't raised her voice once. Jasmine Crockett turned. Not quickly, not theatrically, just with the kind of slow, composed intention that made everyone realize the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Her eyes met Greene's, but there was no anger in them, only clarity. And when she finally spoke, her words didn't crash. They carved. "You can hold that gavel," Jasmine said, her voice firm but never loud. "But you don't get to hold the truth." It was the kind of sentence that didn't need punctuation, because the entire room punctuated it with stunned stillness. Greene blinked but didn't respond. She couldn't. The gavel in her hand, once a symbol of control, now looked like a prop, useless, ornamental, desperate. Jasmine kept going, voice even, every word precise. "You are not the owner of this room," she said. "This room belongs to the people you defunded, the ones who lost protection because of your politics." She didn't point. She didn't shout. But the indictment in her tone landed with the full weight of everything Greene had tried to bury. The silence was thunderous. All around the chamber, people froze. Not out of fear, but reverence. Reporters lowered their pens and raised their phones. Slowly, intuitively. As if recording the moment wasn't just a task, but a duty. A congressional aide shifted in his seat, eyes wide, breath caught halfway. A member of Greene's own party sat stone-faced, jaw clenched, as if knowing the tide had turned and there was no swimming back. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need validation, because the silence said it all. This wasn't defiance, it was truth. And in that instant, it belonged to no party, no office, no title, but to every unheard voice whose protections had been stripped away, while people like Greene clung to power, disguised as authority. The silence that followed Jasmine's words didn't dissipate, it deepened. It wasn't just a pause, it was a verdict. And as it settled like a heavy curtain over the chamber, Marjorie Taylor Greene sat motionless, caught in a moment she could no longer steer. The authority that once surrounded her like armor, through sound, posture, title, had evaporated. What remained was instinct, an instinct for Greene, translated into a simple, desperate act. Both hands clamped around the gavel in front of her. Not to use it, not to restore order, but to hold on to something, anything, that hadn't yet slipped from her grasp. Her fingers curled tightly, knuckles paling under pressure, shoulders locked. It was not the grip of control. It was the grip of someone unraveling slowly, trying not to let it show, but it did show, and someone saw it. From the back row of the press pit, a CNN photojournalist, quiet, attentive, waiting, lifted their camera. No flash, No warning. Just a single frame caught between two heartbeats. The shutter clicked as Greene's head bowed ever so slightly, eyes cast downward, the weight of the moment visibly pressing against her spine. The photo captured more than a person. It captured the collapse of a performance. A woman who had begun the hearing with rehearsed dominance now looked like a figure consumed by the very gavel she once wielded with pride. The image would be transmitted within minutes, but its impact would last far longer. Greene, fists clenched, back slightly hunched, holding the gavel not like a leader commanding order, but like someone terrified of what would happen if she let go. And still, Jasmine sat calm. Still. Resolute. The contrast was undeniable. Around them, no one moved. Aides looked away. Fellow lawmakers stared forward, lips pressed tight, unsure of whether they were witnessing drama or history. But the truth was undeniable now. The gavel had become a symbol not of power, but of fear. And Greene's grip on it wasn't about silencing others. It was about not being silenced by the consequences of her own unraveling. The hearing may have ended in silence, but the storm had only begun, because outside those marble walls, the world was already watching, and the world did not blink. It took less than 90 minutes. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, her voice razor sharp, her hands still, her words measured with surgical clarity, was spliced, captioned, and blasted across every major social platform before the chairs in room 2141 had even cooled. The edit was simple, a tight shot on Jasmine as she leaned forward and said, "You can hold that gavel, but you don't get to hold the truth." Then again, "This isn't your stage. It's the people's chamber." 10 seconds of footage. No music. No need for drama. Just truth caught raw and unfiltered. And it spread like wildfire. On YouTube, it climbed to trending spot #1 in under 2 hours, surpassing celebrity scandals and even breaking news from overseas. On Twitter, now X, it reached over 4 million views before noon. By nightfall, the hashtags were impossible to ignore. The People House. Jasmine did not blink. Screens lit up across homes, cafes, subways, campuses. People who hadn't followed a congressional hearing in years were suddenly watching it on loop. They didn't need the full context. They saw a woman stand unshaken against manufactured outrage and win. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened her broadcast with the clip. "In a chamber built to silence dissent," she said, "someone just reminded them who the building really belongs to." The camera then cut to Jasmine's line again, and again, and again. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's chamber." It was no longer just a sentence. It was a banner, a reckoning. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene scrambled for damage control. Less than 24 hours later, she held a hastily arranged press conference in front of the Capitol steps. Cameras were already rolling as she approached the mic, but the difference was stark. There was no force in her stride, no command in her voice. "There's been a lot of misinterpretation of yesterday's hearing," she began, her tone defensive, strained. "This isn't about politics. This is about protecting the integrity of women's sports in our schools." But the script fell flat. Reporters didn't shout questions. They let her speak. Let the unraveling happen in real time. One journalist from Politico tweeted mid-press conference, "She's not addressing the document. She's not addressing the email. She's addressing a fantasy." And they weren't wrong. Greene's words were rambling, her examples recycled, her posture rigid but unconvincing. At one point, she tried to laugh off the now viral moment. "People are taking one line out of context," she insisted, referring to the People's Chamber quote. "It's performative outrage from the left." But even as she said it, a young protester in the background held up a sign reading, "She didn't shout, you did." That moment, too, went viral. Fox News, once Greene's safe harbor, offered only the briefest coverage. Their late-night anchor summarized the hearing in 27 seconds and then pivoted to gas prices. No panel discussion, no defense, no outrage, just quiet distancing. Behind the scenes, it was worse. Multiple GOP aides leaked that some of Greene's staunchest allies were furious over how she'd handled the moment, and how she'd handed Jasmine Crockett a microphone and a moral high ground on national television. By the third day, the ripple had become a wave. A moderate Republican congressman, when asked by reporters if he supported Greene's handling of the hearing, gave a half smile and simply said, "I wasn't in the room." Another, from Arizona, reportedly left a caucus strategy session early, saying he had no interest in cleaning up that mess. On the House floor, Greene's usual circle appeared thinner. Conversations ended as she approached. Staffers kept eyes on their phones. And Jasmine? She said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. She returned to her district, visited a shelter, and continued working on legislation around reproductive health care. When asked by a local reporter about the viral clip, she simply said, "I wasn't performing. I was telling the truth." But the internet didn't need more from her. The image was etched, her seated, calm, steady, the eye of a storm someone else had started. Her words had become a rallying cry, not because she yelled, but because she didn't have to. Memes appeared almost instantly. One featured a split image, Greene mid-shout, gavel raised, and Jasmine seated, lips just parting to speak. Caption, "Guess who's still in control?" Another showed a screenshot of Greene's clenched hands wrapped around the gavel, zoomed in from the CNN photographer's shot, with the overlay text, "Grip doesn't equal power." Political satire shows reenacted the hearing with near-verbatim scripts. Editorial cartoons showed a shrinking podium labeled authority, while a growing shadow behind it read accountability. But beneath the humor, the hashtags, the virality, there was something else moving, something slower, deeper. People who had long felt ignored by power began sharing the clip, not with jokes, but with reflections. A mother in Michigan tweeted, "I've been silenced in too many rooms. Jasmine Crockett reminded me it's not about volume, it's about conviction." A teacher in Ohio wrote, "I've been told to stay in my lane too many times. Today I sent my students the hearing link. This is civic courage." By the end of the week, Jasmine's quote had been printed on T-shirts, projected onto a digital billboard in Times Square, and referenced in 3 Sunday sermons across the country. Civil rights organizations began circulating it as a banner line for renewed efforts around educational equity. One group, the People's Collective, even launched a digital campaign titled The People House, organizing grassroots town halls across red and blue districts alike. The second hashtag, Jasmine Did Not Blink, took on a life of its own. It wasn't just a reference to her composure in that one moment. It became shorthand for what resistance could look like. Measured, principled, unflinching. Veterans used it in posts about speaking truth to superiors. Nurses used it in solidarity posts about standing up to hospital executives. Even corporate whistleblowers quietly adopted it, tagging it beneath anonymous essays. This wasn't politics as usual. It wasn't a partisan brawl or a soundbite war. It was a rupture in the rhythm, a shift in who got to speak and who got to be heard. And in that shift, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed one person's lie. She had illuminated the machinery behind it and reminded everyone watching that power isn't in the volume. It's in the truth that endures when the shouting ends. In a week saturated with noise, cameras, and headlines, the most powerful moment came not from a microphone or a trending hashtag, but from a folded piece of paper in a plain envelope, slipped quietly onto Jasmine's desk. It arrived late, after the buzz had dimmed, after the headlines had begun shifting, after the digital world had spent days dissecting every frame of the hearing. Jasmine had returned to her office in the Rayburn building alone, seeking a rare moment of stillness. Her staff had left hours earlier. The lights were dimmed, the city humming low outside her window. She sifted through a stack of mail on her desk, most of it predictable. Policy memos, donor mailers, committee notices. But one envelope stood out. No return address, no postage meter. Just her name, handwritten in pencil, soft and uneven, like the writer hadn't yet mastered the curve of every letter. She opened it gently. Inside was a letter folded in thirds, lined paper with faded blue ink and small slanted handwriting. The words were simple, but they didn't need polish. They carried more truth than any viral video ever could. "Dear Ms. Jasmine, my name is Maya. I'm 10. I live in Alabama. I watched you on TV with my mom. You look like her, and you didn't let them stop you. That's the first time I saw someone like us not be scared, not be small. I told my teacher I want to be a lawyer too. Thank you for not stopping. Love, Maya H. Jasmine read it twice before she felt the tears. They came quietly, without warning, without shame. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the kind of tears that fall when a part of you that's been clenched for years suddenly softens. She leaned back in her chair, holding the letter with both hands like it was something sacred. Because it was. In a world where every word she spoke was twisted, attacked, or applauded, this letter was unfiltered. It wasn't political, it was personal, and that made it everything. She set the letter down on her desk, smoothing the creases. Then she reached for a pen. No staff, no speechwriters, just her, the desk lamp, and her response. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate, each word chosen not for sound bites but for truth. Dear Maya, thank you for your letter. It meant more to me than I can explain. You're brave. You're brilliant. You're exactly what this world needs. People may say you're too loud, too bold, too much. But here's the truth. You're not too loud. The world has just been too quiet for too long. Speak anyway. Walk tall. Don't wait for permission. You don't have to look like power to carry it. Love, Jasmine. She signed it slowly, placing the pen down as if sealing something far more permanent than ink. Then she sat in silence, staring at the folded note, feeling something shift inside her. Not ambition, not strategy, but purpose. The kind that doesn't come from elections or hearings, but from letters like Maya's. From the quiet voices who have never had a mic but carry the weight of generations in their small, determined hands. She thought of Maya's mother, of the women who never made it into the rooms Jasmine now sat in, of the ones who were told to wait, to smile, to shrink, of her own mother, standing on aching feet in nursing shoes, writing grocery lists next to unpaid bills. And she realized this was never about one hearing, one headline, one takedown. It was about reminding someone like Maya that truth, spoken plainly, could still shake the pillars of power. Outside the Capitol, the world kept spinning. But inside that quiet office, with a letter from Alabama and a reply sealed in truth, something more enduring took root. A girl had seen her future in Jasmine, and Jasmine, in turn, had seen her past in that girl. And in that perfect human loop, truth moved forward. The letter from Alabama had reminded her why. But justice, real justice, doesn't end in applause. It demands follow-through. And so, without cameras or clamor, Jasmine returned, not to be seen, but to make something undeniable. It was 1 week later to the hour, the same corridor, the same marble gleam on the floor, the same door plate, room 2141, Committee on Oversight. But the atmosphere had shifted. The air was thinner now, as if the building itself remembered what had happened, what had been exposed, what had cracked open and refused to be sealed shut again. Jasmine Crockett entered alone. No press releases, no podium, no armor, just a manila folder tucked under her arm and a quiet fire in her step. The Capitol buzzed around her, but like passing wind. Her silence turned heads more than a press swarm ever could. Clerks whispered as she passed. A few aides stood straighter, unsure whether to greet her or give her space. She needed neither. Her focus was locked, her presence magnetic in its restraint. On her shoulder, a navy coat draped unbuttoned, and beneath it, a sharp-cut charcoal suit. Not flashy, not dulled. Just deliberate. Just enough. In her left hand, that same folder, the one that had lived in headlines for a week. Except this time, it held not evidence, but action. Inside the folder was a petition, no theatrics, just ink and signatures. Addressed to the House Committee on Ethics and Oversight. Subject: Request for formal investigation into the deliberate use of unverified and altered government documents during the October oversight hearing. The language was calm, legal, measured, but the subtext was fire. Jasmine wasn't appealing for attention, she was demanding consequence. And behind her words were 28 signatures, 7 of which belonged to Republican colleagues who had since quietly stepped away from Greene's orbit. They didn't announce it, but they signed. Jasmine never mentioned their names. She didn't have to. She approached the clerk's desk with the kind of stillness that made noise unnecessary. The young assistant behind the counter looked up, clearly caught off guard. Jasmine nodded once. No smile, no ice, just presence. "For the committee chair," she said simply, sliding the folder across the polished oak. The clerk reached for it, fumbled slightly, caught by the sudden weight of something bigger than it looked. Before the woman could stammer a question, Jasmine had already turned. But instead of heading for the exit, she did something else. She walked toward room 2141. The chamber door was closed, locked, no session scheduled, but its presence loomed like a monument. Jasmine stopped in front of it, just short of touching the handle. She didn't look around. She didn't pose. She simply stood there, one breath, then two, and whispered something not for microphones, not for media, but for the room itself. "Justice isn't what you say, it's what you survive for." And then she walked on. No one chased her. No one asked questions. But a CNN intern stationed down the hall happened to be recording B-roll for a later segment. They caught the moment, the stillness, the words, the walk. Later, that 10-second clip, silent except for her heels and that single sentence, would eclipse every pundit's hour-long recap. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. The camera followed her, not fast, not zoomed, just trailing from behind. She didn't look back. The sun had begun to shift through the tall windows of the Capitol, casting warm columns of light down the corridor. As she walked, her shadow stretched longer, crisper, dragging behind her like a story that refused to end on someone else's terms. The light fell on her back, framing her not as a spectacle, but as a silhouette of intent. Staffers moved to the side instinctively, not out of reverence, but out of understanding. One older man, gray at the temples, tie slightly loosened, watched from a distance, then whispered to a colleague, "That's what courage looks like when it's not looking for credit." A woman seated nearby dabbed at the corner of her eye. "She came back," she said, "not to shout, just to finish what started." And that's what made the moment feel sacred. Because power in DC is almost always performative. It arrives in headlines. It feeds on reaction. But Jasmine Crockett had done something else, something rarer. She let the noise fade, let the cameras chase others, then returned quietly precisely when it mattered. Not to go viral, but to set the record. The petition would be time-stamped, archived, and forwarded. It would force a hearing, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but it was now part of the congressional record. A truth Greene could no longer erase with another press conference, another gavel slam, or another distraction about woke ideology. This wasn't noise. This was a trigger, a filing with the weight of accountability behind it. As Jasmine turned the corner and disappeared from view, the frame of the camera held just a few seconds longer. In that corridor, the lights hummed softly, and the echo of her footsteps slowly faded into marble silence. There were no chants, no flashbulbs, just the image of a woman walking forward, with the law behind her and the truth still unfolding in her wake. And in that silence, America didn't hear a roar. It heard the one thing more lasting, a reckoning, whispered, filed, and now irreversible. The echo of Jasmine's steady footsteps faded down the marble hallway, but the aftershock of her stand kept pulsing outward, demanding not just applause but understanding. And that need for understanding is where every lasting lesson begins. Courage in the face of orchestrated hostility is not a cinematic surge of violins and spotlight. It is a decision made in the space between heartbeats, repeated until the noise around you finally breaks before you do. Jasmine Crockett's calm, her refusal to let volume dictate validity, reminded a nation that power rooted in spectacle collapses when confronted by power rooted in substance. She did not meet rage with rage. She met it with documentation, with chain of custody stamps, with highlighted paragraphs that could outlive every decibel in that room. The injustice she confronted, race, gender, systemic erasure, expected her to perform either fury or defeat, because those narratives are easier to dismiss. Instead, she performed due process, verifying sources, citing statutes, forcing the gavel to justify itself. In doing so, she flipped the psychological script, making Greene's weapons fake documents and louder lungs, look less like authority and more like panic. This is lesson 1. When confronted by manufactured outrage, slow the tempo. Make the moment last long enough for the lie to decay in real time. That tempo shift is where truth survives its first assault. Yet courage alone is not the measure. It is the precision with which that courage is deployed. Jasmine's silence, that unnervingly steady silence, proved that restraint can be an offensive tactic, not a defensive posture. By refusing to interrupt, she let Greene's rhetoric burn through its fuel unchecked, exposing its own contradictions. When the forged confidential stamp finally arrived, the audience had already witnessed a dozen smaller cracks, and the big rupture felt inevitable, earned, damning. The injustice at play counted on adrenaline to muddy the evidence. Jasmine turned adrenaline into a lens, cooling the room, sharpening the focus, forcing every camera to zoom where it belonged. This is lesson 2. When liars bet on chaos, give them silence long enough to drown in their own echoes. Let their story fold under the weight of its missing footnotes. And when you finally speak, speak with receipts, because a receipt is louder than any microphone. The third lesson rises from the ashes of every gavel Greene slammed. Positional power is brittle when separated from moral power. Titles, podiums, gavels, they project strength, but they do not generate it. The House hearings showed exactly how quickly authority unravels when its legitimacy is exposed as theater. Greene's authority was performative, built on the assumption that most people won't double-check a confident lie. Jasmine's authority was procedural, evidentiary, patient. She weaponized the rules that were meant to silence her, forcing them to protect her instead. This is the fulcrum of systemic change. Learn the mechanisms so well that you can reverse their pressure, bending the institution toward people it once crushed. Injustice thrives on exploited ignorance. Dismantle that ignorance, and injustice becomes a paper tiger holding a counterfeit stamp. Beyond the walls of Congress, the viral tsunami proved that society still recognizes authenticity when it sees it, no matter how scarred the public trust has become. Millions watched not because they enjoy partisan blood sport, but because they recognized a universal scenario, a bully abusing procedure and a calm challenger refusing to flinch. The injustice of daily life, bosses who shout, systems that stall, gatekeepers who misquote policy, mirrored itself in that chamber, and people saw a blueprint for pushing back. You don't always need a louder voice. You need an undeniable fact placed on the record where erasure can't reach it. Hashtags like the People House and Jasmine did not blink were more than slogans. They were shorthand for collective relief. Someone just demonstrated live, on C-SPAN, that the machinery of misinformation can still be jammed by a single well-timed truth. The cinematic lesson here is mass empowerment. One documented sentence can outtrend an empire of spin, and every citizen who retweeted that moment became a co-author in the continuing footnote of accountability. Power, once seen cracking, is easier to challenge the next time. Yet virality fades, paperwork doesn't. Jasmine's immediate filing for an ethics investigation transforms spectacle into jurisprudence. A critical transition many movements never make. It's easy to trend, harder to codify. By submitting a bipartisan petition, she translated emotion into enforceable scrutiny, turning a viral moment into an official docket item that the institution must answer for. This is lesson 5. Outrage without follow-through feeds cynicism. Outrage translated into procedure chips away at precedent. Injustice isn't only public, it's bureaucratic, thriving in footnotes no one files. By putting her allegations on congressional letterhead, Jasmine forced the machine to look in the mirror it built. Every organizer, whistleblower, and everyday worker can replicate that model. Document, escalate, formalize. Justice moves slower than fury, but once it enters the record, it becomes very hard to erase. The 6th lesson is deeply personal, stitched into the handwritten letter from Maya in Alabama. Movements survive not on headlines, but on succession, on younger voices who see themselves in today's fighters and refuse to believe the world is immovable. Maya's words, "That's the first time I saw someone like us not be scared," are an indictment of every institution that ever banked on invisibility as a strategy. Jasmine's tear wasn't weakness. It was a pressure valve releasing years of generational expectation. In that moment, she proved that vulnerability and ferocity can inhabit the same spine, that tears need not contradict resolve. For every parent who shrinks at the dinner table news cycle, for every child absorbing secondhand doubt, that single exchange wrote a new script. Courage can look like you, sound like you, cry like you, and still win. The filmic takeaway is that representation isn't decoration. It modulates what entire generations consider possible. Injustice loses its omnipotence the moment one child realizes it can be challenged. Seventh comes the paradox of silence. Speaks volumes if wielded by someone who also knows precisely when to break it. Jasmine's whisper outside room 2141, "Justice isn't what you say, it's what you survive for," could have been lost in the marble acoustics, yet it resonated farther than Greene's televised tirades. That line reframed justice from abstraction to endurance. Not a proclamation, but a pilgrimage. Injustice often counts on short attention spans. It writes long pressures, hoping truth-tellers will tire first. Jasmine answered with a roadmap of stamina, showing that survival itself is a form of resistance, that lasting long enough to file the paperwork, sign the petitions, teach the next girl is revolutionary labor. Audiences addicted to instant catharsis must learn this slower thrill. Paperwork served cold can scorch hotter than any viral flame. If you want systemic change, marry the lightning of exposure to the glacier of persistence. Finally, Greene's image, white-knuckled fists around a powerless gavel, thrusts forward the ultimate moral. The louder injustice screams, the more certain it is that truth is closing in. That photograph is a cautionary frame for every would-be demagogue. Propaganda is a brittle crown, and once the cracks show, the glare of scrutiny only widens them. Greene's panic was not just personal humiliation. It was institutional karma, proof that the system can still recoil on those who use its tools to harm. Jasmine did not humiliate her with insults. She humbled her with evidence. And that distinction is the spine of democratic accountability. We do not jail lies with bigger lies. We jail them with provable fact. The cinematic energy of the entire narrative rests here. The villain is not destroyed by the hero's fists, but by the villain's own forged documents turned against her. That is storytelling rooted in civic realism, and it is a teaching text for every classroom discussing power, integrity, and the mechanics of change. The spark has been struck, the smoke has cleared, and the stage is now ours. If we step out of the audience and seize the lights before another counterfeit gavel tries to claim them. Begin where every empire of spin hopes you will skip, the ballot line. Register early, re-verify often, memorize your precinct code like you memorize your phone unlock pattern, and escort 2 first-time voters past every bureaucratic choke point because 3 ballots change an entire precinct's math. When pundits insist your district is safe, remember safe is just code for the complacency we predicted, and then dutifully detonate their projection with a turnout surge they will call impossible until the county clerk posts the final tally. Carry pocket copies of budget pages Greene tried to shred, those footnotes about shelter cuts and research cancellations, and read them aloud to undecided neighbors while you all wait in the drizzle. If your polling place relocates at dawn, live stream the detour, timestamp the new address, post directions in 5 sentences so no intimidation squad can pretend confusion is coincidence. Volunteer for a local candidate who publishes every donor receipt nightly. Make transparency your litmus test because secrecy is the womb where forged memos gestate. After election night, audit provisional ballots like a forensic accountant. Then share the findings in plain language threads so even your least political cousin knows how many voices got stuck in pending. Democracy is not a Tuesday ritual. It is sustained public surveillance of every form, every count, every rubber stamp. If cynicism whispers that one vote cannot matter, replay Jasmine's 10-second clip and remember how one documented sentence toppled a fortress of bravado. Your single line on a voter roll is a lever. Pull hard enough and policy budgets shift. Outrage evaporates, documentation endures. Convert fury into records power cannot incinerate. Flood congressional inboxes with focused demands. Quote, Rule 11, Section 2, J1 verbatim, and insist on a hearing standard for document authentication, because staffers can stonewall emotion, but stumble when constituents cite procedure better than they do. Submit Freedom of Information Act requests for every confidential report a politician brandishes on camera, then publish the requests in every day of silence that follows, turning bureaucratic delay into public shame. At city council meetings, arrive with a phone on record, annotate the agenda in real time, and post unedited clips before you reach your driveway. Sunlight kills more disinformation than any fact-check graphic ever will. If you sit inside an agency, screenshot sketchy directives, store them on encrypted drives, know the federal whistleblower statute number by heart, and remember that leaking misconduct is not betrayal. It is the patriotism your civics teacher promised, but your headlines seldom show. Donate a weekend transcribing PDFs for investigative reporters. Your keyboard becomes a lance when it transforms scanned images into searchable text that lawyers can cite. When tabloids quote unnamed experts, amplify Jasmine's scalpel question, source, page, watermark, because gaslighting fails when the audience carries flashlights. Keep a laminated cheat sheet of your state's open records deadlines on your fridge, power banks on the hope you've forgotten the calendar. Make diligence a social ritual. Compete with friends to see who can file the fastest open meetings request. Toast every release like a birthday candle, extinguishing corruption's oxygen. Remember, paper trails are the arteries of justice. Clog them and the system seizes. Clear them and accountability flows. Movements built on individual heroics collapse at the first long night. So erect neighborhood watchtowers of vigilance. Form kitchen table, document clubs that dissect local budgets the way sports fans parse box scores, line by line, dollar by dollar, because the slush fund for the next forged report often hides under consulting fees. Rotate activism roles. 1 week you live tweet a school board meeting, the next you design infographics explaining property tax hikes, and the next you babysit for a fellow watchdog so they can present findings without worrying who's picking up the kids. Teachers, youth group leaders, and librarians curate mini curricula on media forensics, teach students to check a PDF's creation date, to reverse image search a chart, to recognize when a watermark is missing. Faith leaders weave civic courage into sermons, reminding congregants that integrity is faith in public form, and that silence in the face of deception is complicity wearing choir robes. Small business owners post QR codes linking to verified primary documents next to the checkout register. Let commerce double as a truth distribution network. Tech-savvy volunteers build public receipt repositories where annotated evidence lives free from paywalls, so no citizen has to fight propaganda unarmed. Mental health advocates schedule debrief circles after high-stakes hearings. Activism is a marathon staged in a hurricane, and burnout is the sabotage injustice counts on. Celebrate micro wins, like a city clerk updating an online archive, because momentum compounds when gratitude meets grit. Money is the megaphone of modern politics. If we don't aim our dollars at transparency, they will echo in the hollow chambers of disinformation instead. Pledge a recurring donation, even $5, to an investigative newsroom that sues for public records. Every invoice they file is another brick pried loose from the fortress of secrecy. Fund legal aid clinics that defend whistleblowers. Greene's allies know that lawsuits can silence truth-tellers faster than debunk statistics. So bankroll the shield before the arrows fly. Skip one streaming subscription and redirect the savings to a tech nonprofit building open-source metadata tools. A timestamp algorithm can shred a forged document faster than any televised cross-exam. Support state-level candidates who pre-publish full policy drafts online, reward the ones who invite open annotation, and starve the ones who hide bill text until the midnight vote. Crowdfund public service fellowships for data analysts willing to audit municipal finances, because the next crooked memo often begins as a misfiled receipt in a dusty bookkeeping folder. If a corporation underwrites a politician's misinformation campaign, weaponize consumer power. Screenshot the sponsorship, share coupon-sized boycott instructions, and watch PR departments learn Jasmine's lesson in quarterly report language. At tax time, earmark a portion of your refund for civic tech hackerspaces because every open data portal shaves minutes off the next investigative expose. Celebrate corporations that adopt radical transparency charters but verify quarterly. Capitalism repackages virtue faster than snake oil salesmen in a gold rush. Let your budget testify louder than your tweets. Financial fluency is civil rights muscle in a century where receipts, quite literally, rule courts and feeds. Movements die when fatigue outlasts fury, so bake stamina into the mission. Schedule rest rotations, where activists hand off responsibilities like runners in a relay. Because a burnout activist is a silent feed, and silence is power's favorite soundtrack. Build archival media kits so future volunteers can leapfrog the learning curve instead of reinventing the wheel. Injustice counts on each generation forgetting the last playbook. Host quarterly receipt parties, re-reviewing stored evidence, updating broken links, screenshotting again to outpace disappearing web pages. Memory is a weapon. Keep it loaded. Train successors the moment you master a skill. Gatekeeping expertise replicates oppression. When mainstream coverage fades, as it always does, create micro-documentaries, TikTok explainers, and podcast recaps that resurface key proofs for fresh audiences. Partner with mental health professionals to normalize decompression rituals, hiking meetups, art nights, silent retreats, because a healed activist outthinks a harried one. Mark anniversaries of pivotal wins with community service projects. Tie historical triumphs to present tense usefulness so victories do not fossilize. Finally, raise every child in your orbit on Jasmine's mantra. You're not too loud, the world has been too quiet, until it echoes louder in playgrounds than misinformation does on primetime airwaves. Because the only thing harder than forging a fake document in the internet era is forging a generation that refuses to check the watermark. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.